So my goal with this course is to introduce you to the huge variety of symbology, cartography, data visualization tools that are in QGIS. I think this is probably the area that QGIS has seen the most growth, let's say in the last 5 years. And now that QGIS has this thing called the temporal controller that lets you animate time-based data, and there's the 3D viewer that lets you put data into 3D and also create fly-throughs in that environment. And there's so many different tools that it's a very robust environment at this point. And so the course online will be mostly me demonstrating techniques to you. But at the end of each of the 2 course sessions this week and next week, I will be sending you an assignment so that you can then replicate what I've done on your own, and I'll be giving you resources to do that with. I should add that I don't expect that everything I show you is going to have some direct application to your workflows and your data necessarily. Some of what I show is meant to just show you the possibilities of what you can do with geodata and QGIS and inspire you to try new approaches. So, since we're working with data, a lot of the techniques that you might choose for a specific application are going to depend on what that data is like. So we're going to show a variety of different things in the course. The session is being recorded, and so what I do is I will upload this course to YouTube as an unlisted YouTube video, so you have to have the link to watch it. And I'll make the YouTube video available later today once it's processed, and then you can rewatch the course and sections that you need to rewatch. So I think I introduced myself in the introductory video, but just quickly, my name's Kurt Menke, and I work for Septima, which is an open source based geo company in Copenhagen, Denmark. I moved to Denmark 2 years ago. I'm an American citizen and moved here 2 years ago. I've been involved with QGIS for quite a long time. I'm a QGIS author, and I've been using QGIS for quite a long time at this point, since it was at version 0.7 in 2005, and I started teaching it quite early too, when it was at version 1.0 in 2009. So I've been teaching QGIS for a long time, and I'm generally just a big fan of what it's become. It has become a fantastic tool. So today's session will go for 2 hours, and at the end I'll be giving you an assignment to be completed before the second class. The second class will be, a week from today, next Tuesday, we'll have this question and answer session. And this is an optional time. You don't have to jump on this, but I recommend it because hopefully in the intervening days, you will have had a chance to work on the assignment or apply some of the techniques to your own data. And this is just a chance for us to have an informal chat about any issues you encountered or questions you have about techniques or applying them to other data. So we'll have that next Tuesday. And then the second class section will be next Thursday, same time. All these will be the same Zoom link, so you can use the same Zoom link for all these calls. So the second class session will be another 2-hour session, and I'll give you an assignment after that to be finished by the 20th of February. And then we'll have the second question and answer session the following Thursday. So today we're going to start with some tips and tricks for working with print layouts. I'm not going to go over all the basics of setting up a print layout, but if we have a small group, so if you have questions about that, we certainly have time to take a couple of detours to show you things. But we're going to look at some tips and tricks for making layouts nicer and working with some labels. We're then going to look at layer effects, which are this capability QGIS has to where you can set up drop shadows, inner glows, outer glows, things like that for your vector layers, points, lines, polygons. We're then going to look at elevation renderers and how we can make beautiful color hillshade maps in QGIS with elevation data. And that will kind of merge into these things called blending modes. And again, these are standard algorithms for blending GIS layers together. They're actually tools that are found in originated in graphics software like Adobe Photoshop and GIMP and Inkscape and Illustrator. And so QGIS was the first desktop GIS to incorporate those, and they've been in there for quite a while, and they allow you to do some really interesting things with your data. And then we'll look at rendering points. QGIS has some special renderers for points. And then we'll finish up this afternoon by looking at how we can make nice maps of coastal areas with some coastal cartographic effects. And next week, we're doing more advanced topics like working with expressions to make more complicated, more powerful symbology. And we'll look at these things called geometry generators. We'll look at working with time-based data, the 3D environment, and we'll finish up next week with mesh data, which is kind of a hybrid data model between vector and raster that is used a lot with meteorological data, weather data, and also for some flood modeling and oceanographic software outputs, mesh data. But we'll look at some interesting mesh data sets and what you can do with it. So in terms of resources, you'll get a recording of this session. There will be, in the assignment that I send you at the end of the day, there will be short videos that cover each individual task that I covered. So if you don't want to rewatch the whole course session, or if you don't want to read the step-by-step instructions, you can just watch a quick video to see how to do something. And you'll have those, they'll be there forever. So you'll always have those to refer to. And I'll give you a document with step-by-step instructions as well. So you'll have all of that material to go back on. And we'll take a break at the top of the hour. One thing I want to start with is we're going to be working with colors today. And there are a variety of ways to define color. And we're going to be working with a few of these. So first off, this little screenshot here is the color picker in QGIS. And it has all the main models for defining color. It has HSV, which is hue, saturation, and value. It has RGB, which is red, blue, and green. So this particular color that's in here can be defined with these numbers using hue, saturation, and value, or it can be defined with these numbers using red, blue, and green. So the red, blue, and green sliders will go from 0 to 255. So 0 for red would be black, and 255 would be pure red, essentially. And so you can use these sliders to change colors. There's also an opacity slider, and QGIS also comes with hexadecimal notation. So this is this is how colors are defined in HTML. And sometimes designers will provide a color as a hexadecimal color. And so in QGIS, it's nice that you can also plug that definition of a color in to use it for a feature. And this is a nice image that I like to use to explain how to work with color. And this focuses on using the hue, saturation, and value model. So when you're working with hue, saturation, and value, the hue is the color wheel with the primary colors, red, blue, green, around the outsides, and then the intermediate colors. And so if we are looking at pure red, for example, on the color wheel, the saturation is then going to be pure red on the continuum between white and the full saturation of that color, red. And so if we slid across the saturation slider, we could vary that hue from full saturation all the way to white. And the value is the same kind of thing, but it goes from black to white along this triangle. And so in this triangle, you get basically every variation that you can get for this particular hue. And so you can use, on the previous slide, these sliders to control the color. And so sometimes you have a color that you might like, but you want it to be a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. And so you can use the saturation slider to make it lighter or more saturated. You can use the value slider to make it darker. And so that's one way I use these tools to fine tune a color and get it just right. So I'm going to get out of PowerPoint and spend most of the rest of the day here in QGIS. Here today, I think I have open 328, which is set to be the next long-term release in a couple of weeks. So if you're unfamiliar with the release schedule for QGIS versions, every spring they designate the current stable version of QGIS as the long-term release. And so they support that long-term release for an entire calendar year. So in a few weeks, when 328 becomes the next long-term release, 328 will be supported all through 2023 and early 2024 as a stable piece of software, meaning it won't receive any new features. It won't change. The only thing that will happen is that you can install bug fixes or patches throughout the year, but no new features. So it becomes very stable. So most people use the long-term release because of that. It's a stable piece of software. And when you're trying to get work done in the office, you don't have to worry about things changing. At the same time, there's also the latest release. So currently 328 is technically the latest release, but again, we're at this point in time where it's about to become the next LTR. And so what I'm going to do is start with some showing you some tools for working with labels in a print layout. So I'm going to open up a project that happens to be in a geo package. So if you haven't stored a QGIS project in a geo package, the way you get to it is you, instead of choosing open and just choosing a QGIS project file, you choose open from, and there you have a couple choices. You can open up a project from a geo package, from inside an Oracle database, or a PostgreSQL database. So I'm going to choose the geo package. So this little window pops up, and I'm just going to browse to the database, which is, well, first of all the data that I sent you is organized into these subfolders by topic. And so today I'm going to start out in the Denmark folder, and there's a Denmark geo package in there. So I'll click open, and then QGIS will tell me how many, which projects lie in this geo package. So there's two projects in here, coastlines and Denmark, and I'm going to open up the Denmark QGIS project. So here we have just a map in one part of Denmark, and there's a couple cartographic styles here. First off, the forest. Well, let me back up. We're also, another thing I'm going to be showing you how to do is work with the layer styling panel. And there's a couple ways you can change styles for a layer in QGIS. And kind of the old school way would be to right click on the layer, open up layer properties. Wrong window. And layer properties opens up, and you have a symbology tab. And so you can change the symbology from here. And while I'm here, I can show you what I was going to show you, that the forest layer has two different types of symbols here. It has a random marker fill, and a random marker fill allows me to put markers within the polygon. And so here I'm using SVG markers of trees. So you can see that the random marker fill is using an SVG marker here, and the SVG, the symbol I'm using, is a tree that ships with QGIS. And the random marker fill has settings for how dense you want the points to be within that polygon. So you can, you have a couple different choices for setting that up. And then in addition to this random marker fill, there's the green polygon underneath it, which is just a standard QGIS simple fill, the default symbol for a polygon in QGIS, but it has a lighter green fill and a darker green stroke. Otherwise, it's a fairly standard symbol. So what makes this symbol kind of a little more special is that there are two different symbol layer types. So as we work with symbols in QGIS, we have this hierarchy. So here, if I select the fill component of the symbol, all I can really change is the color and the opacity. But if I choose simple fill, then I can change the fill color, the fill style, the stroke color, the stroke width, all these different aspects of it. So this simple fill is what we call in QGIS a symbol layer type. And so there are many symbol layer types in QGIS, and we're going to look at several of these today. Simple fill is the default for polygons. And when you're working with a symbol in QGIS, this may have been the default symbol and you made it green, but you can also click this green plus button to add a symbol layer. And that's what I did when I created this to add this second symbol layer type, the random fill. And so basically the style becomes almost like a list of layers in the layer panel where you have different components of the style, and you can add to a style to make it more representative of what you're trying to show. So this second symbol layer type initially would come in as a simple fill by default, but I changed it to random marker fill and then set that up. So this is the old school way of changing symbology, is through layer properties. But what we're going to do is the better way. In my layers panel, there's this little paintbrush button on the upper left corner. And if you hover over it, it says open the layer styling panel. So if I click on that, it opens up this panel to the right. And from here, I can change all the same aspects of my symbol, but the benefit is that you see the changes on the map instantly. You don't have to click apply and move that layer properties window out of the way to see what happened. You can just start changing the symbols on the map and see the change instantaneously. So we're going to be working with this layer styling panel. So we have this forest layer, and then we have this water layer. This water layer is using this trick that we're going to explore at the end of the session today, called inverted polygon shape burst fill. So essentially what's happening here is this water layer is a copy of this municipalities layer, but it's using inverted polygons, which makes it the opposite of what it was. So instead of it being municipalities, it's everything outside the municipalities or the sea. So we're going to see this at the end of the day. How can you use this technique to quickly make a nice coastal map like this without having any data for it? So that's a couple of the tricks that are already going on in this project that we're going to look at more carefully as we go through the day.
Kurt, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Okay, so so how far? So when you do the opposite, the shape burst fill, and you do the opposite, do you define a bounding box? How far out do you?
No, it goes out forever. So if I zoomed out to the whole world and I just had Danish municipalities, the whole world would be blue outside the municipalities. Yeah.
And I had a question as well. The trees had a seed number. Is that to replicate the exact positioning of the symbols on the patches of green?
Yeah, so it's a random seed that just is used to randomly place the icons within the boundary. And so you can change this, and you would, I think, see the trees shift as you change that random seed. You'll see them moving on the map. So there's no desirable setting for that. It's kind of it just picks a random number, but you can change it to just create a different distribution of those markers within the polygon.
Yes, super.
But one thing that is desirable to set is, like in this case, I'm using a density based count, and I'm using 14. So if you increase this, if I make this 50, it's going to add a lot more trees to the forest. So you can control this to reduce or increase the number of points within the polygon to make it look the way you want it to. So this project has a print layout in it. So in QGIS, there is a layout manager. And so if you go to the project menu, there's this series of tools here to access print layouts. This would create a new print layout. There's these things called reports that we're not going to get into. There's the layout manager, which is just a little window that shows you all the layouts you have in the project. And I just have one, and I could click this and hit show to open this print layout. So it's just a simple print layout, zoomed into the same area we were in before. But one thing that sometimes happens is when you are laying out all the map elements, for example, the title or the legend or the scale bar or a logo, it may be that you run into conflicts where if I move this title down here, now it's right on top of that Baltic Sea label, and it doesn't look good. It could even be worse. It could be covering it. And so one thing you can do to control this kind of labeling conflicts in a print layout is by making these different objects label blocking objects. So to do this, you simply select the map object. So this is the key to remember, is select the map object itself. And then in a print layout on the item properties tab, this would be all the properties of my map element here, the scale that it's at, etc. And we have this series of buttons across the top. And one of these buttons is label settings. So if I click on the label settings for my map object, I can see that there's a section called label blocking items. So what I can do is tell QGIS that I want my title to be a label blocking item. So I click the checkbox next to it. And now when I move this label down, or my title down here, the Baltic Sea label is going to move to get out of the way. And so that can be just a very handy way to make sure you don't have those kind of conflicts going on in your map. I could do the same thing. Again, select the map object, go to the label settings tab, and I could make all my objects label blocking. So if I decide I want the legend to go up here, again, the Baltic Sea label is going to get out of its way. So that's one little hidden trick that can really help improve your maps, because whenever you have those labels too close to one another or interfering with something like your legend, it makes it just hard to read. The next thing we're going to look at in this print layout is legend patch shapes. So by default in QGIS, when you add a line layer, it just is a straight line. If you had a polygon, it's just a rectangle. But I guess it was in QGIS 3.16. I think there were these things called custom legend patch shapes added to QGIS. And I'm going to minimize my print layout and get back into the main QGIS window, and I'll close this layout manager. Another thing that's important around the topic of this class is in QGIS, there's this thing called the style manager. It's this little button here. So if I open this, I see a style manager with all the styles that are in QGIS. So I think for the most part, these are all the default symbols in QGIS. I don't think I have anything custom in here, maybe one or two small ones. So these are all the things that come with QGIS, and then you can have different tags. So in QGIS, there's one tag that they have as showcase kind of interesting symbols that come with QGIS. And so you can use any of these on your layers. And you'll see these are divided into marker, line, fill. There's color ramps, and I'll select all to see the color ramps over here. So there's all the basic color ramps that come with QGIS. There's text formats. This is for text like that you might have on a title of a map. So if there's a specific font and size and style of text that you use for titles on maps for a particular project or topic, you can save that as a text style that you can just reuse over and over again. Label settings is similar, but this also stores label placement settings as part of the style. Then we have this section down here called legend patch shapes that we're going to focus on now. And so QGIS doesn't come with any legend patch shapes, it's just empty. But there is a very easy way to import these. And so the QGIS community has an online style repository, and some people have been working on creating collections of legend patch shapes that everyone can download and use. And so I'm going to show you how to do that. So I'm going to go down here to Browse Online Styles. And it opens up this website for all the QGIS styles. And you can see that there are color ramps, fill, line, marker, label settings, and legend patch. So if I click on legend patch, you can see there's some kind of goofy ones like bite of my sandwich. Italian regions, very specific. But then there's this basic legend patch set. And so I can click on this. Is it not opening? Anyway, I thought I could, there it is. It's just slow. And it gives you a little thumbnail of what those different legend patch shapes are. And then you can download that. And what it would do is download a zip file with an XML file inside. So you just download this and unzip it. And then you're ready to bring it into QGIS. So to bring it into QGIS, you simply have the style manager open on the legend patch shapes tab, and you choose import export, import items. Sorry, everything keeps going on to my other window here. And we get this import items. You can either import from a file or a URL. Here I'm going to use the file setting, and I'm going to browse to that XML file that I downloaded just before class. So it was downloaded into this folder, basic legend patch set, and there it is, patch.xml. So I just select this XML file that I downloaded, click open, and I see a whole series of legend patch shapes that will be imported. So I can make some settings. I can choose to add to my favorites. The creator of these may have embedded tags in them, so I can choose to not import those embedded tags if there are some. And I can also create my own tags or not here if I want to. Tags are just how you organize styles in the style manager. And then I can choose to select all or just some and import. I think there's some issue with this. I think there's two called building one. So I'll just say yes, overwrite. So here we have our set of legend patch shapes, and you can see some are for polygons, some are for line, and some are for points. So this is kind of interesting. Instead of just showing a single point icon on your legend, you can show it as, you know, kind of an assorted array that looks a little bit more like the data that you're working with. Similarly, there's ones for rivers, roads, building footprints. So really nice. And so these are really great because they allow you, your legend to really look more like the data that's on there, and makes it more intuitive and kind of lifts your map above other maps. So I'm going to go bring back up my print layout here. And now I can apply these now that they're in my style library. So to do that, I'm just going to select the legend, and here I have the layers in my legend. And so for roads, for example, I can double click on roads. This is where I could change the title of this in the legend, and you'll see this patch section below. And so I can click on this to choose a legend patch shape. So I'm going to choose, set this to all legend patch shapes, and then I'll see all the ones that are line. And I can choose one for roads, for example. Since this is a classified layer, I can also go in here and I could choose one for motorway that's different from the rest if I wanted to. So I could choose, I don't know, road 2 for that. And you'll see here, we're going to look at this in a minute. All these legend patch shapes are simply expressions using the QGIS expression engine to define a series of coordinates for that shape. So the cool thing about this is that you can make your own custom legend patch shapes. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. You can also choose the width and the height of these. So I could increase the size of this if I wanted to. I think the default is 7 and 5. But you can change the size of those. So I can also go down here, and for the municipalities, I could choose a different legend patch shape like that. And so these can just, again, just make the whole thing more intuitive and easier to read, and make it just a more attractive map. Now I want to show you how you can make your own legend patch shapes. And the cool thing is that you can make these from actual features. So if I want a nice legend patch shape for forests on my map, I can use one of these polygons to create a legend patch shape. And so when I'm doing this, you know, some of these forests are kind of complicated and may not make the best legend patch shapes. So I'm going to look for one that, you know, is a little more a simpler shape like this. So I think that'll make a good legend patch shape for forests. Still looks kind of organic. And so what I can do is select this one feature. And then on the editing toolbar, when I have a selected feature, you see copy features becomes active. So I can copy this feature onto the clipboard. And I can clear that. And now I can open up my symbol manager, go to the legend patch shapes tab, and hit this plus button to create a fill legend patch shape. So this will allow me to create a new fill legend patch. And by default, it has, this is the expression for just creating a rectangle. And so I'm going to delete that and paste the expression, basically paste the shape from the selected feature that I had selected. And so we have a little bit of cleanup here, and it looks like a lot of code and kind of complicated, but it's really not. Every one of these you do is the same. If I scroll to the top of this, these are basically all the coordinates with, you know, a lot of decimal places that define the boundary of that forest polygon. And up here, these are all the field names. And I don't need the field names, I just need the geometry. So the geometry starts with this multi-polygon Z function. So I can basically just delete everything before multi-polygon Z. So I don't need attribute columns as part of my legend patch shape. I can just select that part and hit delete on my keyboard so that the legend patch expression starts with multi-polygon Z. And at the bottom here, after all the coordinates, there's going to be 3 closing parentheses right here. And so I don't need, these are all the values of my attributes. I don't need those either. So I can just highlight that and hit delete. And so I will always just have these 3 closing parentheses and the beginning of the geometry function. And so that's what I need to do. And then I can click Save Legend Patch Shape. And it asks me if I want to save it in this project or all my projects. And I can give it a name, forest. I could give it a tag if I wanted to. Click Add to Favorites and click Save. And now I have a new forest legend patch shape that's created from my feature. And I think this is a great feature because you can create something that is identical to what you're showing on the map. And I think that just makes the map that much better when you use an actual building or an actual polygon or an actual line feature from that you see people can see on the map as the legend patch shape. Oops. So back in my print layout, I can select the forest layer in my legend, click on the patch, find forest here. And I can then maybe here, I'll make it a little bit bigger so I can see the trees. So you can click these width and height values until it gets big enough so that it looks as you would like it to in the legend. And now you have a custom legend patch shape that's based on this polygon right here. So you can build your own library of legend patch shapes for things that you commonly work with. And once it's, it doesn't only takes a few minutes, but once it's done, and you can just reuse that as often as you want. Okay. Any questions on legend patch shapes?
Just a comment, I think that was really cool.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think it's amazing. And if you want to get creative, you can create your own series of coordinates with those geometric functions and create your own shapes. Okay, so this is that's the first topic. Next, we're going to look at these live layer effects. And where do I have a slide for this? Yes. So layer effects are, again, these ways to add these different shadows and glows to your vector features. Has anyone used these before? No? So I'm going to show you how to get in and use these. And we're going to look at a couple use cases. We're going to first look at this bathymetry, and then I'm going to show you how I created this crazy looking map of Denmark. So I'm going to bring up, there's too many versions of QGIS open here. Did I close that? Okay, discard that. So we're going to open up a project just the normal way. It's just a QGIS file. This one is not in a geo package. And in the data folder that I gave you, this is going to be in the layer effects folder. There's a bathymetry project. So bathymetry is data that represents the depths of the oceans. And this particular bathymetry set of layers are from this online repository called Natural Earth. This is kind of good to know about. This is if you're just working in Sweden or Denmark, you probably have local data that you can work with. But Natural Earth is a fantastic set of data for the whole planet. It includes things like, I'll paste this into the chat. So it includes data at different scales. And if you choose a particular scale, you can download cultural data, which would be like political boundaries and towns and roads, physical data, which would be like rivers, and then raster, like elevation. So it's just a nice set of data that you can work with, and you can download the whole thing as a geo package. So it's really nice. So that's where I got these layers that we're looking at here. And so I basically just styled the bathymetry as light blue for shallow water to darkest blue for the deepest water. So the depth is in meters here. And if I select one of these layers, and when you're using this layer styling panel, one thing you have to be careful of is that you're working with the correct layer. And if you highlight the layer in the layers panel, it should select it as the layer that you're working with in the layer styling panel. So if I change this, it'll change it over there. If for some reason that's not working, you can just click the drop down and choose the layer you want to interact with within the panel. So layer effects are kind of hidden because you have to expand this layer rendering section down here. So we're going to be working with this a lot for the next few minutes. So in layer rendering, you have an opacity slider. You have these things called blending modes that we're going to look at in a few minutes. And then there's this little thing called draw effects. And I think it's because this has been there for a long time, since like version 2.16. I think the graphical user interface could be a little better at this point, but you simply enable draw effects, and then you click this little star button to open up the effects window. And so you can see here, I have an inner shadow selected. So let me get into that a little bit more, but I'm going to simply I've already created the effect for every layer. I'm just going to turn on layer effects. So all I'm going to do is select each layer, expand layer rendering, and enable effects. And as I do this, just watch the map start to change as I enable the effects on each layer of bathymetry. So what starts happening is you kind of get this pseudo 3D, 2.5D kind of terraced view of the ocean depth. I think the rest of these are too deep for the Atlantic. I think they're all in the Pacific. So we have now this nice kind of visualization of the depths of the ocean. And so I can select one of these layers and expand layer rendering. It's always collapsed. You always have to open it up, and then click on the little star to study the effect that I used. So what I did was use inner shadow. And so I think I used basically the default inner shadow, except I changed the color to a lighter gray. And for all these effects, you can change different parameters for them. So for inner shadow, I can change the sun angle of the shadow. I can change the how many millimeters out from the edge of the polygon that effect goes. And this blur radius is how smooth the shadow fades to no shadow. So you have all these little parameters. But this is almost the default inner shadow that I used for all of these. But it creates this fantastic effect, especially in the Caribbean here, where you get this, nice visual of how it drops off, the continental shelf drops off. So that's one use case for layer effects. And you can see that there's several in here. There's, importantly, source is the original source of the original symbology, basically. So let me, just as an example, show you what happens if I turn all these bathymetry layers off. And I just have the land, and I add an effect to that. By default, I just have source, which is the default symbology. And if I turn that off, the symbology turns off for that layer. If I add an inner shadow to this, you can see what that doesn't really, looks kind of strange. I could add a drop shadow. So by default, the shadow is black, and for the shadow for the bathymetry I had is a lighter gray. And in this layer styling panel, whenever you have this color bar, you can click the drop down and you're going to get the color wheel, and you can use this to change colors. And I could make this a lighter color. If you click the color bar itself, it's going to bring you into this color picker that I showed earlier in the course, where you see the hue, saturation, and value, and RGB. So I could use the value slider to knock this down to a lighter gray, for example. And so at this point, as we explore these, I have a drop shadow enabled. I could turn off the source, and what's going to happen is I'm only going to have the shadow and not the original symbology. And I don't think there's too many use cases for that. But the thing to keep in mind with QGIS is that there's all these little capabilities built into it. And sometimes there may be an example where that works for you. So it's kind of one of the things you have to keep in the back of your head, that you can use multiples of these too. I could use inner shadow and drop shadow at the same time, or I could add an outer glow. And an outer glow, here we have the background of the map as white. If I add a blue layer, the first bathymetry layer, maybe we can see the outer glow a little bit. It's just going to add if I change the color of it to something more obvious, you can see the outer glow just creates a halo around the features. So you could use this for even a coastal effect in this case, the outer glow. And then an inner glow is going to be a glow inside the polygons. So sometimes this really helps, instead of just showing a building footprint polygon, for example, as just a solid color. Sometimes it can be nice to add a little bit of an inner glow or an outer glow around it, just to make it not so flat graphically, just to give it a little more interest. And another part of this is that there's another longer list down here. And I think this is part of the original GUI that was set up for this. They only show these commonly used for inner glow, inner shadow, outer glow, and drop shadow. But instead of drop shadow, I could choose blur or colorize, and that would replace that. So you have to be a little bit careful, because it only kind of lets you show 4 at a time, but you can replace one if you want to. That would just be within this project that you'd be doing that. So that's where you find all of those settings. And again, for each one of these, there's going to be parameters that you can adjust. So the next thing we're going to look at is I think Charlotta saw this last week at a presentation I did in the office, but every November, there's this thing called the November Map Challenge, where you're supposed to create a map every day that relates to some theme. And I can't remember what the theme was for this, if it was blue or if it was polygons or something like that. But I had the idea, since I just moved to Denmark, to think, really anywhere in Denmark, you're close to the coast. So I created this multiple ring buffer around Denmark to show with 5 kilometer increments how close you are to the coast at every point. And I realize that this is a problem down here, because this is just the border with Germany. It's not the coast. But that aside, I thought it was a cool visualization. But by adding layer effects, you can suddenly do something like this, which really makes it much more unique and interesting. So I'm going to show you how this was done. And this one is, yes. So this is another project stored in a geo package. So we go to project, open from geo package. And in the layer effects folder, there's a geo package called DK Coast, and there's just one project in here. So open that up. So we get the kind of just the flat rendering of the multi-ring buffer from dark blue to white. And if I select this layer and expand layer rendering, I can draw effects and I could choose a drop shadow. But what's going to happen if I do this is it's going to just put a drop shadow under the entire layer, not each individual class, like I showed on the PowerPoint slide. So when I was working on this, I experimented with that, and then I didn't think that was really working, so I undid it and went back. But in QGIS, when you have a layer that's classified with all these different class symbols using the graduated or categorized renderer into classes, this symbol button here becomes, it's a master symbol button where I can make changes to every single class, all of them at the same time. So I can click on this symbol button, select the simple fill symbol layer type, and I could, for example, change the stroke color. I could make the boundaries of each one black and wider. Why isn't that changing? Oh, because I have no pen selected. So I could do that, and I could change all the classes to have a black border. But I don't want that. But that's one way people use this master symbol button, is to change something about all the classes simultaneously. But you'll see that there's also a draw effects down here. So this would be drawing effects basically at the class level. So creating a drop shadow around each individual buffered polygon. So if I enable this and open up layer effects, I can add a drop shadow. This takes a little longer to render. And initially it was a little severe, and you see these funky artifacts. And so I simply reduced the amount of shadowing. So I reduced the width of this, so it's a much smaller shadow than the default. And then the blur radius I also reduced, so it was just again, it makes it kind of a thinner symbol, not as dramatic, but still effective. So I just experimented with these settings until it turned into something I like. And one thing about this is that you do still see some artifacts around some of the islands, and I'm not sure why that happens, but interestingly enough, if you go to the map layout, they don't show up in the map layout. The print layout itself looks fine. It doesn't include those. So you can export the print layout in this case and have it look very sharp without any of those artifacts. But that's another use case for layer effects, or another way to be creative with them. I initially tried inner shadow too, which is really strange when you use that. But sometimes these are just things you have to experiment with and see if they create an effect that works for you. I would say the most common use case for these is when you have a busy map and you have kind of the focus of the map is against an air photo or something that's very busy. You can apply an outer glow or a drop shadow to it just to lift it off the map a little bit and separate it so that it gets a little more visual weight on the map, so the map reader can see that feature a little more clearly. That's probably the most common way these are used. Let's see. Any questions on these layer effects? I think just where I'm at, I think the next thing we're going to look at is working with elevation data, and we're just about top of the hour. So why don't we take like a, I don't know, a 5-minute break, and we'll come back at the top of the hour. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
Okay, so we're all back. This is just another example of using a live layer effect for what people call neon cartography, where you, in this case, I have these airplane flight paths, and I made them this, bright pink. And then I add a really wide outer glow to them where I create my own color ramp. And we're going to look at color ramps in this next section, how to do this. Where you create a color ramp from the color of the flight path, that particular pink, out to the black of the background map. And so the outer glow goes from the feature color to the background color. And then you add one extra symbol layer type, a thinner line on top that's almost white, to kind of make it that neon effect. And actually here the planes have a little drop shadow underneath them. So that's another way. Again, this isn't something you'd probably use in the office, but again, it's just kind of showing you something that might be inspiring. And then I have another example. Yeah, this is another map I made for that November map challenge last year, kind of the same basic base map, but I was interested in this. I think the category this day was green, so I found some alien sighting data and used a green outer glow around Denmark to kind of make it spooky, like aliens. Okay, so this next section, we're gonna look at something probably, hopefully, much more practical. This is going to be looking at elevation data, and in the elevation folder, there's a project for Mount Rainier. Often this class is much more international. So this is a US based thing, but since we're all in Denmark and Sweden, I have some local elevation data that I think I'll show you today. There's a Mundsklint project that you can open up, but now I have data for Trelleborg that's in your data. So I'm going to add this layer to my project. So this is one of the Viking ring forts in West Sjælland here. So this is an extract from the Danish height model with 40 centimeter resolution. And so I can quickly make this into a beautiful rendering of the terrain with some of the tools in QGIS. So first off, this overflow there's basically two kinds of basic types of terrain data. There's in English things called a digital terrain model, and that's the landscape with all the built infrastructure and trees removed. So it's just kind of a bare earth data set. This is one that is called a digital surface model because it includes all of the trees, fences, buildings, things like that on the landscape. So when I have this DEM added to QGIS, by default, QGIS is going to use this black to white color ramp and stretch the values from the lowest to the highest, So the highest points are white, the darkest are black here. And this is called the single band gray renderer here in the layer styling panel. And if I click the drop down, I have other choices. And I'm going to choose this one called Hillshade. And so if I do that, boom, QGIS renders this DEM as a hillshade image. Now we can really see the ring fort and the little river valley going past here, and we see some buildings. So if I zoom in, we get a lot of detail with this data, where we can see fields and building footprints and trees. So it's quite nice. So that's fantastic, but we can improve this by right-clicking on this, and I'm going to duplicate this layer. So it's one option. With cartography, I do this a lot. I might have one copy of a layer for one kind of cartography and another one to enhance that. So here I'm going to duplicate this layer. And I'm going to, let me go ahead and turn off the original one. And I'll rename this so I can keep them straight. So I'm going to right click and choose rename, and I'll call this colored DEM. But of course, it's still, since I duplicated the original, it's still using the hillshade renderer. But I'm going to change that for this copy, and I'm going to use the one called single band pseudo color. This basically allows me to give colors to the DEM. And it usually chooses the last color ramp you worked with. So this one really does not work for elevation, but fortunately, there are some elevation color ramps that you can get to from within QGIS. If I click this drop down, there are a series of color ramps here, but really none of these are what I want for this terrain. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new one. So if I go down below all those color ramps, you see the option create new color ramp. And you get this little pop-up. And let me just show you how this works first. This isn't what we want, but I was earlier just describing for that neon cartography how I'd created my own color ramp for the outer glow. And that was a gradient color ramp, this default choice. And if I click this, you can basically go in here and choose two colors. So for that one, I had a hot pink as one color and black as the other color. And so that's how I made that color ramp for that earlier neon cartography example, is just create my own color ramp and click OK. Now we really have an ugly DEM. But another thing I want to show you while we have this ugly, inappropriate color ramp here is that if I like this for some reason, I can go down and choose Save Color Ramp below this, now that I've created it. And I'll put this as a default style and name it Hot Pink. And click Save. And so now I have, well, it should be in here somewhere, Hot Pink. So there I have that color ramp available to me if I want to use it again. So you can develop your own. But I'm going to go back to create new color ramp. And instead of gradient, we have some other choices. And one of the most interesting is this catalog of color ramps that comes with QGIS called CPT City. So I can choose CPT City and click OK. So we get this catalog of CPT color ramps that opens up that we can choose from. And you'll see that there are all these different categories. So there's bathymetry for depths of the ocean, diverging color ramps, greens, and down here, there's even a QGIS one now. That must be the default ones that ship with QGIS. And we see topography. So here I can choose one that's better for my terrain. So I can look at these and say, okay, I'll choose SDA and click OK. And now my terrain is symbolized with that. And again, if I like this, I can go down and choose Save Color Ramp and call this terrain. And if you save a color ramp and you choose the Add to Favorites button, it'll show up in that first list of color ramps. So if I click Save here, this terrain color ramp will be right here in alphabetical order. Okay, so now I have a colored version of my DEM and I have the hillshade rendering. But if I turn on both, one covers the other. And we could certainly use transparency. I could start to reduce the transparency of the, oh, I have the wrong one selected. Here we go. I can start to reduce the transparency of this hillshade layer so that I can start to see the colors through it. This is a little transparency tab. So I did that quickly. Sorry, sometimes I do that. So if you miss a step and I went too fast, let me know. Normally, we're just on this first symbology tab of the layer styling panel, and I quickly switched to the one below it, which is your transparency tab. And I started using the slider to adjust the transparency. And so you can kind of find a sweet spot. But as I keep reducing the and increasing the or decreasing the opacity of this top layer, pretty soon I'm just seeing the color DEM without much of the hillshade. And somewhere in here, there's a sweet spot where you can see enough detail in the hillshade and still all the colors, but it's not perfect because either way, you get kind of the colors get to be kind of faded or the detail in the hillshade is reduced. So that's where blending modes come in. So if I switch back to this first symbology tab, you'll see in the layer rendering section for a raster layer, there's this thing called a blending mode. And these blending modes come in several categories. That first group is the lighten group. This is the darken group. This is the overlay group and the difference group. And so the most commonly used one for this application is multiply. In fact, this is probably the most commonly used blending mode of all of them by far. So I'm going to choose multiply for the blending mode for my hillshade layer. And now it blends it, it multiplies it with the layer below, and I get to see all the colors and all of the detail in the hillshade at the same time. So that looks a lot better. And if we zoom in, we still have all the detail in the hillshade. And we can do one more thing with this. In the elevation data, there's also the digital terrain model. So I'm going to add the terrain model to this area that is just the bare earth. And I'm going to use this one with yet another renderer, the contour renderer. So this terrain layer I'm going to symbolize with contours. And sometimes you have to, well, the elevation range we can see is about 30 meters, and the default contour interval is 100 meters, and that's just too big. So I'm going to reduce this down to 1 meter for my contour interval, and then I'll make the index contour interval 5 meters. So generally, index contours are every 5th contour line, and generally they're made a little thicker. So I'm going to click on the index contour symbol and increase the width of the index contours a little bit. So now I have my contours added to the map, and they're a little strong. I could change the color to brown instead of black, but another option is to try a blending mode on the contours. So if I try multiply, the same blending mode that I use for the hillshade layer to see the colors through it, it doesn't change anything. They look identical. So blending modes aren't always, there are good use cases for them, and this isn't a good use case for multiply. Multiply is best for hillshade and color DEM being combined. Here we want to use one of these ones from this overlay group, this third group down here. So for example, if I render the contours with an overlay blending mode, it just softens them a little bit. In fact, they kind of take on the color of the terrain beneath them. And the soft light is another one, makes them a little more faint. And I like this because it makes it, the information is still on the map, but it blends into the map a little bit more, and doesn't become too busy visually. It's just makes a really nice graphic representation of the contours. So you can try this with any set of elevation data. And I've given you 4 different elevation data sets in our course data that you can experiment with, or if you want to get some data for another area, that's fine. But you can see how quickly you can create a really nice visual of terrain data using all these renderers with the blending modes.
Kurt, I only see the Trelleborg overflade, GHM overflade. I don't see the but I mean, it doesn't matter. We can use something else, but I just, so you know, I don't see the terrain in the data set I downloaded.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's
How
fine. It's
yeah.
just so you know.
Yeah. Huh. Well, I'll make sure everyone gets it.
Okay.
It's easy. It's small. It's easy for me to send.
It's fine.
One other thing that to pay attention to sometimes when you use this hillshade renderer, sometimes on some data sets, you'll get some pixelization, or you'll see the pixels in the underlying data at different zoom levels. It doesn't really, well, you can start to see it in here. You start to see the pixelization of the data underneath. And the one thing you can try to smooth that out is changing this resampling method. So underneath layer rendering, there's this resampling, and I usually change these to bilinear, and it just smooths the data out. So you can see how that makes the data look much smoother when you're zoomed into that level. So that's one setting you can experiment with. And of course, in the processing toolbox, there are tools for creating just a standalone hillshade image. But the renderer is so fast that for just making a quick map, it works beautifully. So then there's no need to create another layer. You can just, use copies of these layers and combine the contour, hillshade, and single band pseudo color renderer with the blending modes and quickly have a beautiful map. Another thing, let me I have a saved version. Yeah. This is a rendering of Mount Rainier in Washington State in the Northwest US. So in this example project I gave you, there is a print layout. So this has been done with the same steps as I did for Trelleborg. But what I want to point out is that in a print layout, if you add, for example, a logo to a map, there are blending modes available for that. So in this example map, there is this made with QGIS logo. And if I select this QGIS logo on the print layout and scroll down in item properties, there's a rendering section for every kind of object on a map. The legend, the north arrow, the scale bar, a logo, they'll all have this rendering section. And you can see that there's a blending mode here. So by default, this is just set to normal, and this made with QGIS logo is black and white. But one thing you can do, sometimes I remember back in the old days, used to have to create a version of our logo with the white stripped out and a transparent background for some uses, and another copy of it with the white background. And you'd have all these copies of your logo for different purposes. But with blending modes, you don't really need that. I can select this logo and choose a multiply blending mode, and that will just strip out the white. And I can just add it to my map and use it without having to worry about that. And then some of the other blending modes can be quite interesting as well. They're just going to create different effects for this logo. So this is another place where you can just experiment with the blending modes and see what they do, because there's going to be a lot of different cases. Addition kind of inverts the black and the white in this case. So you can just keep in the back of your mind that blending modes aren't just for data layers. They're also going to be available to you for all the objects in a print composition, and you can use them in that context as well. So that's layer blending mode. What we're going to do now is look at this thing called feature blending mode. So in the blending folder, there's another geo package called DK roads. And so here I have kind of that same dark background. This effect works that I'm about to show you works best on a dark background. And then I have the OpenStreetMap roads for all of Denmark. So I can actually zoom out to all of Denmark as I do this. You can see they're all there. And they're just symbolized with a this kind of blue line. Nothing special going on. But I can expand layer rendering. And for raster data, you just get one blending mode. It's just for the whole raster, because rasters don't have features. But for vector layers, you'll have layer blending mode and feature blending mode. So layer blending mode is going to blend all the features together. So it's going to just blend the entire layer with the background. And that doesn't really do much for us in this context. But there's also feature blending mode. And what that's going to do, in this case, we have these blue road symbols, and they are the thickness of the symbol and the density of the roads means that there's all these roads stacked up on top of one another. And so we can use a feature blending mode to kind of create a visualization of road density. So the one that works best for this is addition. Addition adds all of the color values together. So if you remember, black is the RGB value for black is 000. The RGB value for white is 255, 255, 255. It's a bigger number. So if we start adding all these blue colors together, pretty soon you get to white. And so that's what happens here. And just by using a feature blending mode of addition on this roads layer, you can see the road density of roads in Denmark. This is entirely dependent on the scale. So for example, if I zoom in, it will change because at this scale, there's fewer road symbols stacked on top of one another. But you start being able to see the finger layout of the city of Copenhagen in this case. And it can be a pretty interesting effect, and it's, lightning fast to create, really. So it's another way that people use these blending modes. And another example of using this is with ship data. So I made this map of 24 hours of ship traffic around Denmark using the exact same technique. It's just shipping lanes instead of roads. So feature blending mode versus layer blending mode, that's the difference. So let me know if there's any questions on that. So what we're going to look at next is rendering points. Yes, so I have a points folder in here with a QGIS project named points. So this is just some data pulled from OpenStreetMap, all the named places in Denmark on that same black background. And so there are how many places here? If I right click and show feature count, almost 7,000 places in this layer. And so certainly at this scale, and this happens a lot with point data, you're getting a lot of points stacked on top of one another. And so if your goal is to show to the map reader the quantity of points in an area, there's a renderer in QGIS you can use for that. So we're just using the default single symbol. So again, when we're using a single symbol renderer, whether it's point, line, or polygon, every feature has the same symbol. So every feature has the same green point icon. And if we click the drop down here, we can see there are some others: categorized and graduated, rule-based rendering, where you set an expression to filter the points, point displacement, point cluster, and heat map. So we're going to look at 2 of these. If I choose point cluster, what it's going to do is add a symbol that shows how many points are clustered at that particular location. And so this is just the default. And so see, it has a cluster symbol. So I can go into this cluster symbol and change any aspect of it I want. The default, it's using a couple different renderers here: a simple marker with a big red circle, and then a font marker with a white font. And the value of this font is the cluster size down here. We're going to look at this next week. So this is a little segue into next week. But you see these little objects to the right of every input to this symbol? These are called data-defined overrides, and they're super powerful because what they allow me to do is point to a value in one of the attribute fields of my data, or write an expression for a given parameter, for the size, for example. And down here, where this data-defined override is yellow with the little sigma symbol, it indicates that there's an expression driving which character is put there. And so there happens to be in QGIS this at cluster size variable that does exactly this. It's being used to put the number on the circle. So that's how that's working. And we're going to look at some other ways to use these data-defined overrides next week. But you can go in there and change that cluster symbol, and then the render settings here, this is simply the other green, the single green points. So we could change the simple marker symbol for the points if we wanted to. So you can change either symbol. And this is another one that's scale dependent. So if I zoom in, there's going to be fewer clusters here because I'm zoomed into the point where the points are not stacked. So just a couple places where there's 2 now. But I have a feeling if I zoom into this part of Denmark, you get bigger clusters still. So this is one handy way to work with points when you have a lot of points and you want to be able to show that cluster. Another
Kurt,
yes.
How do you deal with that in the legend? Because I get the A in my legend if I just don't do anything.
Oh, that's a really
the map
good
layout.
That's a good question, Feld. I don't know if I've even tried that. So let's see. Oh, interesting. Yeah, it does not render that cluster symbol at all. Huh. I'm going to ask one of the QGIS developers about that, and I'll try to have an answer by next week for our discussion session. Yeah, sometimes these effects do not work well to show in a legend. It can be tricky. So in this case, you could, create your own custom legend where you add a shape like a little ellipse, that's the same symbol as the red points, and put a number on top. You could kind of fake it. That's what I would try initially, is to do something like this, where that's not quite big enough, but you get the idea, where you just create your own representation of the symbol for your legend. That would be maybe the only way at this point, but it may be something that just has not been funded, or it's been overlooked or something like that. So in a print composition, there are all these buttons on the left-hand side to add different objects. And so what I did was added a shape. So this add shape, where you can add a rectangle, a circle, or a triangle. And then you have all of the QGIS symbology options for those added shapes. And then this is just add text, and I dropped on top. So it's kind of a hacky way to make it work, but it wouldn't take that long either. But maybe there's another way to do it, so I'll find out. The next one probably has the same issue. I'm going to, instead of point cluster, I'll choose maybe another thing is important. Down here in the bottom of the layer styling panel, there's an undo section. So I can undo this and revert the symbology back to where it was, which is handy. And I think I'll make a copy of this layer, duplicate layer, and the duplicate copy of it is what I'll work with. And for the copy of this layer, I'm going to now try the heat map renderer. So the heat map renderer basically just renders the point data set as a heat map. So you can choose any of the color ramps. And here, you probably want the densest points to be red, not green. So I can click on this heat map, and with any of these, or color ramp, any color ramp can be inverted. So I can click the drop down for color ramp and choose invert to make red the densest locations. And with this renderer, you can experiment with the radius, how far QGIS looks, in this case in millimeters, to find other points in rendering the heat map. You can choose different units for that. And then there's a quality too. This basically just increases the raster resolution of the rendering. So if you choose a higher resolution rendering, it's going to just make it a finer raster rendering of that heat map, and it will take longer to render. And here, in this particular case, it's solid, so it ends up blocking out the base map. So we could drop the opacity of the layer a little bit so we could see the background map through it. Or we could experiment with one of the blending modes to try to achieve a different effect. But that doesn't really work. Usually, for some reason in this case, the opacity works better than blending modes. This is such a dark background, it just doesn't really work. So I'd set this to normal and reduce the opacity a little bit. And then another aspect of this renderer is that you can weight the points. So here there's a population value in the data set for each point. And so I can weight the heat map by population. And in this case, it's going to really show Copenhagen and the other major cities in Denmark. And again, there are interpolation tools in QGIS for creating these kind of raster surfaces from points. But this one just a quick way to render the data that way. And sometimes that's all you need, or it might be useful to just see what it's going to look like before you run a processing tool. So, and it's very quick to use. So keep in mind that for points, you have all these different renderers. The point displacement is, I'm not going into that today, but it's a little funky because QGIS will actually try to move the points from their location so that you can see them all. So you have to be careful because you're physically moving the points at that point. And there's settings for how much to move them and several different methods. So it's quite a few settings to work with in the point displacement renderer. But there are certainly cases where it works well. So we have about 20 minutes left. So the last thing we're going to look at, sometimes you'll see old historic maps. The maps people made in the previous century were quite nice. A lot of times, older maps, and especially around coastal areas. So you'll see these older maps where they have like this, in English, we call this a coastal vignette, where you have a little bit of shading around the coast to kind of represent the water, not just as one solid color, but to give it a little bit of depth. Another technique that was used in the past with these kind of buffered lines out from the coast, these multi-ring buffers to represent the coast. And usually a lot of times they would fade with distance from the coast, or be tighter towards the coast and spread out as you got into deeper water. And so there are ways to duplicate those kind of effects in QGIS, and that's what we're going to finish up with today, looking at coastal effects. So this is going to be another project that's in a geo package, and it's going to be from the Denmark folder in your data. And we first looked at the Denmark project, and this time we're looking at the coastlines project in this geo package. So it's all basically the same data, but here we're zoomed into this archipelago south of Funen. And we have all the basic data that we started out looking at the beginning of the afternoon, but we're going to try to represent the water here. So I'm going to start by just duplicating the municipality layer, the land basically. Make a second copy of that. And I can move this above municipalities, and I'm going to rename this water. So I have a polygon layer of municipalities, and it's symbolized as a single symbol. So every polygon has the same light brown polygon. But I'm going to change this to inverted polygons. And what that's going to do is make this the opposite of the land. And I can change the color of this so that, boom, I have the sea represented because I've inverted the land polygon and given it a blue color. So this is nice, so that's kind of a dark blue, but we can make this effect quite a bit nicer than just giving it a straight blue background. We can combine this inverted polygon with a shape burst fill. And so the way you change this is you select this simple fill. So again, the simple fill with polygons is the default symbol layer type, and it gives you access to the fill, the stroke, the fill style, the stroke style, etc. And so I'm going to select simple fill, and then from this symbol layer type menu, choose a different option. I'm going to choose shape burst fill. So shape burst fill basically just allows you to blend the colors from along a color ramp or between two different colors. So I'm going to use this 2-color method, and I'm going to just define the first color as kind of a, let me check my notes here. Yeah, the first color is going to be kind of a light blue. So I'm going to define this. Yeah, exactly. This is the same color I was going to use. 225, 255, 255. So this is a very light blue. That's the first color. And then the second color, I'm going to make a darker blue. So this is going to be an RGB value of 166. I'm just going to plug the numbers in. 206 and 227. Okay, so now the sea is looking a little better, a little more natural. And I have these 2 colors that it's grading, kind of blending between. And there's several parameters that you can use with this shape burst fill symbol layer type. The first we set was the gradient colors. Next is the style of the shading. And the default is whole shape, but we're going to change that to set distance. And what this does is it allows you to define how far from the polygon edge one color blends into the next. So I can give this a bigger value to make it a wider, basically almost like an outer glow from the coast. Very similar to using an outer glow in reality. So I can set the distance, and then down below I can change the blur strength. And this blur strength basically defines how smoothly one blue blends into the next color of blue. So as you increase this value, it's going to be a smoother transition from one color to the next. So you can see if I move this all the way up to the end, it becomes a very smooth gradient. And I'm going to set this, yeah, pretty close to that, like maybe 15. Not quite all the way, but close. So now I've created what I call a coastal vignette in English. And so I've just, in a few minutes from my municipalities layer, created this data for the seas. And so I love this because you can do it quite quickly without having any data. You don't have to find ocean data or anything like that. You can just invert something and use it. The other really common use case for inverted polygon shape burst fills is if I were to have a study area and I wanted to provide focus for that study area. So if I create a new, quickly just create a new layer, temporary scratch layer called study area, and I make it a polygon. And okay. And I just quickly create a polygon of some sample study area. So there's my study area. So if I was going to want to render this on a map, I could use that inverted polygon shape burst fill. So I can choose inverted polygons for my study area, and it creates a mask around the study area. And then I can choose shape burst fill as the symbol layer type. And then I can choose kind of a maybe black or dark gray to white. Maybe not black, but dark gray. And then for the set distance, reduce that a little bit. It kind of creates like a drop shadow around my study area. And then you can go down and give it a little bit of opacity. And now you have your study area kind of popping off the map. you can still see the everything beyond the study area, but you're kind of providing a window of focus onto the study area. And I think it's a really elegant way to show that kind of thing. And you can see it's quite fast to do. You can tinker with the settings, but within a few seconds, you can create a mask around your study area that really makes it look nice. So people use that effect quite commonly. And the last thing we're going to look at is another way to create a coastal effect. They're called Ben-Ray dots. So Ben-Ray dots is basically the same technology that's used to print photographs in newspaper, where it's kind of, you can see the individual points. If you look at a photograph in a newspaper under a magnifying glass, you can see the points that composed it. So we can use that same kind of effect to kind of create that stippled boundary around the shoreline of all the islands. So to do this, I'm going to create another copy of municipalities. And I'm going to rename this one as dots. And I'll go ahead and turn off water. And for this one, I'm again going to use inverted polygons. But this time, instead of a shape burst fill, I'm going to use a point pattern fill. So earlier in the afternoon, we looked at random marker for the forest. This is similar. It's just a different way to fill a polygon with points. Point pattern fill, it creates instead of random points, it creates a regular series of points in a polygon. And so I have my regular points, and I don't want big red points in the ocean. That doesn't look so nice. I'm going to use one of the same blues I just used. And so this is another little trick that, again, I apologize sometimes I do this quickly, but if you click on the drop down for one of these colors and you see this color wheel, down below you'll see recent colors. And if you hover over those, you'll actually see the RGB and HSV values for those. So you can choose one of your recent colors quite easily and just reuse it. There's the hot pink I chose earlier in the afternoon, and the different blues I've tried and things like that. So I can use the same blue that I'd used before for these dots. And for the stroke style, the ring around the point, I'm just going to change it to no pen so that I just have blue dots. And I'm going to make them quite a bit smaller. So they're going to be hard to see initially, but I'm going to make them like less than one, just very small blue points. So that I have very small blue points. And now I want to go back to the point pattern fill settings and change how those points are displayed. So I'm going to make them much denser. So instead of the distance, both vertical and horizontal, being 15 millimeters, I'm going to make this 1.5 and 1.2. So now I have a very dense array of light blue points in the sea. And the last thing I'm going to do is there's a displacement setting. So I can displace them horizontally a little bit, which will make it not a regular grid, but more like, you know, the way bricks are aligned in a building where one brick is stacked over two others. We're going to kind of create an effect like that. So I'm going to put 0.75 as the horizontal displacement. And now they're not really regular, well, they're regular, but they're not in a perfect grid. They're shifted. Okay, so almost done with this look. We're just going to enhance the symbol by adding another symbol layer type to it. So we have point pattern fill, and now I'm going to click this green plus button to add another symbol layer type to my symbol. And whenever you do this, it's going to be a random color, and it's going to be the default for that geometry. So for polygons, it's always going to be a simple fill. But I'm going to change this simple fill to a shape burst fill. And then I'm going to change some of the settings. So I don't want this dark blue to white. I want transparent to white. This is kind of a strange, there's like a glitch I've noticed in QGIS. It might be a bug that needs to be reported, but to make this first color transparent, I found I need to make it white first, and then I can go in and make it completely transparent here. I don't know why. I have that in the directions, so. But now you can see it's transparent with that cross hatching. So I have transparent and white as my two colors for my shape burst fill. And finally, I'm going to go down to set distance. And as soon as I click that, you can see now we have this effect where we have the dots just around the perimeter of the islands, because we have a point pattern fill covering the whole sea. And then we have a shape burst fill that's kind of acting as a mask over that. And since it's going from transparent to white, the transparent is near the coast. So you're seeing just the points near the coast. So if I increase this set distance, I'll increase the distance away from the coast that I see those points. So I can set that to some place that I like. And now I have a different coastal effect. And you could tweak this in a lot of different ways. Instead of this simple marker being a circle, you could go down here and make it a line and change the orientation of the line and do kind of a different kinds of stippling effects with different shapes. So you could experiment with different looks for this kind of stippled coastal effect. But now we can turn on the water underneath. And for this dots layer, the last thing is to use a blending mode of multiply so that we can see the other layer beneath it. Now kind of both effects are kind of combined. I don't know if that really works that well, but you can see how you could kind of go crazy creating lots of different effects with this. So that's some coastal cartography that you can experiment with. And the other thing that's going to kind of a segue into next week is the other way that people commonly look at coastlines are with these inner logarithmic buffers around the edges of a coast. And so this is done with what we're going to look at next week with this renderer called a geometry generator that lets you create an expression, which can be simple or complex, to change how a feature is rendered, changes the actual geometry of the layer and how it's being rendered. And you can do some interesting things like this with that. And I have another example of this area using that. This one is a little more heavy for QGIS to compute for such a big area. So it's sitting there rendering. It's much faster for the lake. But in a few moments, this will pop up. And so next week, we're going to look at this geometry generator and show you how you can do things like this. I'll paste this expression in. So you can have that to think about for next week. So are there any questions? I know I went through a lot of material today. So again, you'll be able to watch the recording and you'll have all the step-by-step videos and step-by-step instructions for everything I've showed, so you can make more sense of it as you go through the exercises, hopefully. But we have a few moments for questions. No. I don't know how long this is going to take to render. But hopefully you can see that there's a lot of interesting things you can do in QGIS. Here's the rendering of the coastal buffers. Exponential coastal buffers. That's the official name for these, because you can create buffers to create this effect, but this is done on the fly with this geometry generator, and the buffers are exponential. They get farther away from the coast. Oh, so QGIS, you have a question. Color ramp is not with values. So yeah, I mean, maybe you're asking about the color ramp in relation to the shape burst fill. Yeah, it has nothing to do with the depth of the sea or anything like that. It's simply a distance from the polygon edge, either in map units or in millimeters. So it's simply for cartography. It's not really based on any ocean depth or anything like that. So,
but if you want the data like from the heat map, is there a parallel tool in the geoprocessing toolboxes that then you can get the density data?
Yes. So in the QGIS toolbox, there's a tool set for interpolation. And so there's a heat map kernel density algorithm you can run to create a data set of heat map that you then have values for. So this algorithm simply takes a point layer and has some settings for radius. So you could try that. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
All right. Any thoughts before we end the session?
I just think it's. I knew that it was there was a lot of options, but I just think it gave me what I wanted, some info and some inspiration on trying stuff out myself. So I'm looking forward to dig into it.
Fantastic.
It was it's fun.
Yeah, this is
No, it's useful.
it is kind of
it's more than fun. It's useful, I think. Yeah.
Yep, kind of where art meets science. Yep. Great. Well, look for your inbox later this afternoon for the video and the exercise and other resources. And I will see everyone next week.
Yep.
Yep.
All right.
Good.
Thanks, bye. Bye-bye.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you.
You're welcome.